Okay, well, good afternoon. I feel kind of guilty having you all in here when the weather's like this outside, but hopefully you won't regret it too much. So I'll be presenting on some research that I've been doing for a number of years, about 4 or 5 years. Traditionally, I've come from journalism studies. Most of my work in the past had to do with the relationship between press and politics. I'm interested in issues of media control, censorship, alternative media, and so on. But a while back, I realized that the traditional threat that we used to be worried about, which is basically controlled by the state, didn't quite capture all that was going on in the world. Increasingly, and you see this especially in Asia, where more and more states are liberalizing the media. The media artists, writers are beginning to realize that the threat sometimes comes from non-state actors, in particular intolerant publics. I remember speaking to a very senior Chinese journalist and editor who said that, look, back in the 1970s and 80s, when she first started out, you had to worry about threats from the Communist Party. Now it's become a bit more complicated because you've got to worry about threats from government, business, and the people themselves. In the case of China, that threat comes from sort of hyper-nationalism. People can get very intolerant of media that are too critical of their own country, for example. Personally, I found myself more and more interested in the threat of religious intolerance on media freedom, and that's what got me into this work. So I have just finished a book titled Hate Spin. I guess I should start with definition. If it reminds you of hate speech, that's not accidental. That's, in a sense, a starting point for this, for my explorations of the subject. And as you know, hate speech is traditionally thought of as any kind of vilification against any sort of identifiable group, which could be racial, religious, ethnic, sexual minorities, and so on. Yeah? And it is a very political process. Hate speech is thought of as something more than just individual anger against someone who's different. Hate speech is a political tactic used to marginalize a group, to mobilize one's own supporters through identity politics. Yeah? One of the most extreme cases of hate speech occurred a little more than 20 years ago in the Rwandan genocide. So a classic case of how speech is more than just something harmless. Yeah? Before the genocide, for about a year, a radio station was actively promoting hatred against the Tutsi minority, calling them cockroaches, and then when the genocide was about to start, actively inciting people to go out and kill. Yeah? So this was a clear case of offensive speech followed by violence, yeah? Extreme violence, genocide. Yeah? And this pattern of offensive speech that is followed by violence is something that is common all over the world, maybe not in extreme a form as genocide, but in terms of, certainly in terms of unruly mobs, destruction of property, protests against publishers, artists, and so on. Yeah? Another case that seems to follow the same logic would be this, the video Innocence of Muslims from 2012, which is still in the news today because it was thought for a while that this video was what provoked the attack on the US diplomatic compound in Benghazi, which turned out not to be the case, but Hillary Clinton continues to be blamed for initially thinking that it was provoked by this video. So here again was a classic case of offensive expression followed by violence. What happened in Benghazi turned out not to be because of the video, but there was genuine violence in many other countries. There were deaths, there were injuries, there were fatalities, that were provoked by this video. So is this hate speech? Sometimes it is talked about as if it is. Charlie Hebdo is talked about as if it's hate speech. The Prophet Muhammad cartoons of 2006 sometimes also referred to as incitement and hate speech because of this pattern of offense followed by violence. But if you think about it, it's not. Because in classic hate speech, the violence moves in the same direction as the offending words. The sticks and stones follow the words. In this case, it's reversed, isn't it? You actually have a case of where the community that is accused of the offensive expression is itself targeted by the violence. So if you think about Charlie Hebdo, the Prophet Muhammad cartoons, the Innocence of Muslims video, and so on, those that were responsible for the offensive expression were not actually inciting violence against the vilified or targeted group. The violence went in reaction to the offending expression. So this is an important distinction. Violence that is provoked by offensive expression is not incitement in either a legal or sociological sense, although sometimes it is talked about as if it is incitement. And this distinction between provocation and incitement is extremely critical, and I'll explain why later. But what I should stress now is that once we look at this class of events, we realize that the term hate speech doesn't quite capture what's going on. And I looked around for a term and couldn't find one. So I invented my own, which is hate spin. Right? Hate spin I described as the manufacture of either vilification, which is hate speech, or incitement, or indignation as a political weapon. Political weapon to marginalize opponents, to mobilize your own supporters in a way as a means of contentious politics. Yeah? So whereas hate speech can be thought of as the giving of offense, this political strategy involves either the giving or the deliberate taking of offense as a political weapon. We can think of it in sociological terms as an instrument of contentious politics. So this comes from social movement studies. And of all the various theories out there about this form of expression, I found that the political sociologists' work on contentious politics, which covers the gamut from social movements to protests to revolutions, seems to offer the most sort of fertile theoretical ground to plant the project in. Yeah? So you can think of hate spin as a method of contentious politics used by political actors who, for whatever reason, don't find the conventional avenues of politics, lobbying, party mobilization, and so on, enough for its purposes. So what I've done in my project is to try to emphasize that hate spin is not, although it is often characterized as such, not a case of visceral, spontaneous reaction against offense. If you think about how the media often report these incidents, even the language that they use is often extremely misleading. Some of the most intelligent newspapers in the world will routinely talk about a video that sparks violence, right? A book that triggers protests. Those words like spark and trigger suggest that this is some kind of chemical or mechanical process. Right? If you think about it, that's extremely, it's very strongly suggestive and to me very misleading, because it leads you to a certain policy prescription as well. It is misleading because it frames the community that is taking action as somehow unable to help itself, which to me can sometimes sound a little racist. Right? If you're saying that a religious community cannot help but explode that to me sort of denies their agency, denies their ability to think through problems and so on, number one. Number two, if indeed we buy the fact that this community can only react in a violent way once it is exposed to this offensive expression, it is like, for example, lighting a match and putting it on a barrel of oil or whatever. Yeah. Then in terms of policy prescriptions, it seems as if the only way to avoid the problem is to ensure that that match is never lit, which to me has profound implications for freedom of expression. I mean, if you are going to say that certain communities cannot help but explode when we introduce them to offensive expression, that leads us to the policy prescription that, well, maybe then we should avoid offensive expression. Yeah? So this is in fact extremely, this has profound policy implications, despite, I'm not saying that these issues are deliberately framed this way, but the unintended consequence of framing these incidents as trigger or spark type of events is to create this impression. It is often also framed in terms of the clash of civilizations thesis. This was the idea first mooted by the political scientist Samuel Huntington after the end of the Cold War, who suggested that the new lines of global conflict would be between the civilizational forces, that the West would be in conflict with Islam, the Confucian world, and so on. And so this frame of looking at the West as inevitably in conflict with Islam in particular has been extremely powerful, although most political scientists have debunked that theory. But in terms of popular discourse, it has, I think, has a very powerful hold on people's imagination and the way we think about any such incident. The moment we see Muslims in particular unable to contain themselves, the moment we see them protesting against some new manifestation of Western free speech, it's often framed as, oh, here's the clash of civilizations again. My thesis is that this is, again, profoundly mistaken. Yeah? This is not a clash between the West and Islam. If we go deeper, we will always find, in fact, this is just routine politics. It's nothing as grand as a clash of civilization. These are political actors in each situation who find it in their interests at that particular time to take advantage of the situation for their own ends. Yeah? So in order to show this, I engage in comparative case studies. Yeah? The case studies that I've looked at are a set of global cases which are fairly well known. Most of them, over the last 20, 30 years, the transnational cases have involved a Muslim outrage. Right? But it's not really true that this is unique to Muslim society. Probably one of the larger, more important cases of the 20th century involved the book, The Last Temptation of Christ, for which the Greek author was excommunicated from the church. There was, in fact, violence against the publisher and later the film and so on, because Christians felt offended. But certainly since Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses in the late 80s, Muslims have cornered the market in terms of transnational offense. So every major transnational case of offense taking has involved indignant Muslim communities. Yeah? But if you look at the national picture rather than global picture, a very different picture emerges. Among democracies, the most frightening and serious case actually comes from India, where the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, came to power largely because of his economic promises, but certainly aided by a very deliberate policy of using hate against Muslims to mobilize the Hindu ground. Right? And so what we had in 2014 was a Hindu nationalist party coming to power and kicking out the previously secular and much more minority protecting Congress regime. So India is the largest democracy in the world. The other case that I look at is the world's third largest democracy, Indonesia, where there has been rising intolerance among Muslim hardliners, threatening the cause of Indonesia's rather young democracy. And of course the US, where when I first started looking at this a few years ago, it wasn't really making headlines yet. But this year, of course, this topic no longer needs any introduction. Yeah? We see Donald Trump using this, quite cynically, the fear of Islam as a political weapon. I notice he's retracted, or at least temporarily, it depends what day you ask him, a number of other things that he's argued for. So he fudges on things like abortion rights, he fudges on torture and so on, but he's never actually retracted this, this idea that the US should keep out most Muslims until we figure out what's going on. And that, I think, to me, is less a sign of his own individual belief in the cause, but of course more a sign of his very politically astute sense that this is a group that he can vilify with very little political cost, yeah? And that he can gain political points from it. What is most significant, though, about Trump's use of Islamophobia is the network on which he relies on. So it is not just Trump by any means. As you know, there is an industry behind him that has been tracked by civil rights groups, anti-hate groups in the US for some years. A very sophisticated campaign of using fear of Muslims for political ends. And it's their studies, their arguments that he, as well as Ted Cruz, have drawn on. So it's really that group that I've been studying in my research. Rather than go through each of these countries as national case studies, I thought what I'd do is to try and tease out what I think are the main lessons from these case studies, and I will talk about each of these lessons, drawing on examples from my case studies. So what I think I have found is that hate spin has certain interesting characteristics. Number one, that it is, we've got to look at it as a strategic, something of strategic character that deserves quite careful scrutiny. Second, that it employs versatile methods. And third, that it is a distributed and networked political strategy. So let me talk about each of these characteristics in turn. The first is that hate spin is something strategic. When we see a campaign like this is a part of Indonesia's anti-pornography campaign, which was really the first reaction against its democratization from 1989. This campaign typified a lot of other sort of reactionary conservative campaigns in the sense of being more symbolic than literal. What do I mean by that? There's no doubting the seriousness with which the hardline Muslim elements pushed this new anti-pornography law in Indonesia, right? It sounded that they were extremely serious about it. But if you ask Indonesians today, what was the net outcome? The bill was, in fact, ultimately passed in a watered-down form, but still it was passed, right? On paper, it would mean that practically anything that offended Muslim hardliners, including Western dress by women, including provocative dancing and so on, would be described as porno action and therefore actually a crime. Has it actually changed the way Indonesians live? Not at all, not at all, right? So what is going on? I mean, it looks as if, in hindsight, that this anti-pornography campaign wasn't really intended to remove all provocative, mildly sexual practices or messages or expression from Indonesian society. Rather, the campaign itself was simply a way to assert the values of this community. And this, in fact, is very similar to analyses of the anti-pornography campaigns in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, as well as the whole prohibition fiasco. Analysts who have looked at the temperance movement, for example, in the US, realize that the groups behind it who were intent on removing alcohol, intent on removing pornography from the US, were not particularly interested in enforcement. They didn't really care. So it was a campaign for its own sake. What were the benefits that that campaign gave them? It gave them a platform on which they could assert their values, they could tell politicians not to take them for granted, and so on. And that pretty much is what seems to be what was happening in Indonesia with the anti-pornography campaign as well. And there are many examples of this, of how the strategic objectives of any such censorship campaign differs from the actual, from what is stated. Yeah? Some anecdotal examples are these. I mean, I mentioned earlier that Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses was one of the major censorship cases of the late 80s. India was the first to ban the book outright, and as you know, the Ayatollah Khomeini had a death warrant against Salman Rushdie. Pakistan, of course, banned it. A number of other countries banned it. I asked friends in India and Pakistan, where the book is still banned, to check whether they could order it on Amazon. And you can. You can order Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie freely on Amazon using the government-owned ISP in the case of Pakistan. What's going on here? Is it because South Asians are not net savvy, don't understand IT? I mean, we know that's ludicrous. I mean, of course the South Asians understand IT. What about Indonesia? Indonesia banned the Innocence of Muslims video, which in 2012 was just a 14-minute trailer. Yeah? So Indonesia, as well as Singapore and about 14 other countries, asked Google to block it from those territories. Later, the full-length movie for which that trailer was a publicity vehicle, more than an hour long, came out. And I personally checked when I was in Jakarta if that movie could be viewed on YouTube in Indonesia. And it can. Right? Again, is it because the Indonesians are not IT savvy? No. Indonesia has among the world's most social media active populations. Right? There are very few countries that are as crazy or as knowledgeable about how to use social media as Indonesians. So how do you explain this paradox of 1 year or for a few months you have hardliners declaring that they absolutely cannot abide the existence of this expression online, and a year or two later, it's okay. What's going on? Another case of where we should not take these campaigns too literally. In a particular year, in a particular season, it is politically convenient to declare that this artifact, this video, this book, and so on is something absolutely prohibited by their religion. The next year, some other thing appears on the political agenda, and they move on. That's fairly typical of hate spin campaigns. So the benefits that are gained from such campaigns are largely symbolic. Here's another case. Every couple of weeks in downtown Jakarta, 2 churches from just outside Jakarta come in to central Jakarta and have their worship in the open. Yeah? It's just outside the presidential palace. And they do this because for many years, their efforts to build their own church have been blocked by hardliners in their district. Yeah. So superficially, this looks like, well, just another case of how the world's largest Muslim country, Indonesia, yeah, is inherently inhospitable to other faiths, right? This is a classic case of Christian-Muslim conflict. But I asked the church leaders, what's going on? What's this all about? And they say, oh, it's money. It's just that we refuse to pay a bribe. We have been approached directly by the groups that are making life hardest for us, and they tell us explicitly, just pay this and the problem will go away. Right? So this has to do with corruption. It's not the clash of civilizations. And they say that, in fact, most of the churches in their district get by paying a bribe. They've chosen not to because they recognize what is at stake. These two churches are unusual in having won their cases in the Indonesian Supreme Court. So they realize that they've got to take it all the way and persuade the government to stand by the Supreme Court's decision. So there's something larger at stake here that has to do with Indonesia's respect for religious freedom and so on, which is why they've opted for this long-term legal strategy rather than simply making the problem going away by paying a bribe. But they're absolutely sure that this has nothing to do with Muslim-Christian conflict. In fact, they make a point of having Muslim leaders from more moderate groups join them at their worship services every fortnight. Yeah. In India, in the state of Gujarat, which you may remember in 2002, was the site of pogrom, described by some as a genocide. About 1,000 Muslims were massacred in state-sponsored violence. Again, if you speak to the individuals who are there now, the Muslims in Ahmedabad, still today suffer from what I think, without exaggeration, could be called a state of apartheid. Yeah? They are kept separate in their own ghetto. There's literally a wall. This is Donald Trump's dream country, I guess. There's literally a wall built through the center of the city, or on the fringes of the city, keeping the Muslim ghetto away from Hindu homes. Yeah? Paid for by the Hindus, they didn't make the Muslims pay for it. But again, if you speak to the Muslims who are suffering this sort of indignity, is this a case of clash of civilizations? Is it because different religions cannot get along? They're absolutely clear that this has nothing to do with that. I mean, they grew up with Hindu neighbors and lived peaceably for a long time. This is what one of the individuals who witnessed the genocide in 2002 and still lives in Ahmedabad told me. This is nothing more than the political use of the fear of Muslims. Yeah? There are strong men, notably now Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, who needs to feel like a Superman, needs to feel like a superhero. Every hero needs a villain. The rest of this quote said, every superhero needs a supervillain. And so the Hindu nationalists in India need the existence of a Muslim minority on which they can blame India's problems. Yeah? So ironically, I mean, in all three countries that I visited, the people at the receiving end of the worst discrimination have extremely acute political vision. None of them call it a clash of civilizations. None of them are blaming religion for it. All of them see quite clearly the political agendas that are behind this, and the monetary agendas as well. When I say that the intent of hate spin agents is largely symbolic, I don't mean to suggest that therefore we needn't take it too seriously. In fact, I would say that this is what makes hate spin even scarier than it would otherwise be. Because what we find is that those who use hate spin can win even when they appear to lose. Let me give you an example that would illustrate this. This is a mosque in Middle Tennessee, right? Around the same time as, I guess, the more famous controversy, which was the controversy around the so-called mosque at Ground Zero in New York, the building of this mosque became a huge controversy as well. The same anti-Muslim groups went down to Tennessee when they heard about this mosque project and were intent on blocking it because they thought, look, this is the Bible Belt. This, if our campaign works anywhere, it would be here. Yeah. And so this little community of Muslims, I mean, they didn't know what hit them, right? They never had any problems from the locals, from the local community, but the artillery from the national anti-Muslim campaign came down and made this an issue. But as you can see from this picture, the mosque stands, right? The mosque is there. The anti-Muslim groups did not succeed, and I'll go into the reasons why later. But what they did succeed in doing is use this campaign as the way to spread anti-Muslim propaganda. Let me give you one example of what they did. Because this mosque was in an area gazetted as, or zoned as a residential area, the local regulations said that the only non-residential use that was permitted in this place just on the outskirts of Murfreesboro was for a house of worship. Yeah? So this land could be used either for residences or for houses of worship. So one of the legal challenges that the opponents came up with was to argue the court that this can't be considered a house of worship because Islam is not really a religion. It's in fact political doctrine, it's a violent political doctrine. So they actually took that to court. Right? And so you have press reports coming out saying that, okay, now the court is being asked to decide whether Islam is really a religion. Of course they lost, right? But the important thing is that that argument was given airtime, right? That the court process was used to advance an outrageous claim that Islam is not really a religion. So in that sense, the Islamophobia merchants actually did succeed even as they lost the court case. Because what they succeeded in doing was to take fairly outrageous claims and give it a high status forum that would have gained the attention of many more people than would otherwise have any patience for that kind of argument. Yeah. So you had the ridiculous situation of where a judge has to rule on this. You had federal prosecutors coming in to declare that, look, Islam really is a religion, and so on. It reminds you of Trump, doesn't it? Because it's one of those things where wonder why in the world does theoretically the most advanced society in the world have to waste time on such nonsense? But that's exactly what hate spin allows its exponents to do. You get airtime for outrageous views that shouldn't even be within the public debate. Yeah? The Islamophobia network in the US is probably the most sophisticated at this game. This is a campaign that you might be familiar with because I understand it actually did surface in Seattle a few years ago. This is a campaign of buying space on the metro systems for anti-Islam advertisements. So this particular ad, I think, was in San Francisco. Right? So what this particular group does is to target metro systems around the US and try to buy space on buses, trains, and train stations and so on with anti-Muslim messages. Yeah. So on the surface, this seems to be like a campaign to get this particular message out. That's why they're buying that space. But no, they're actually thinking several steps ahead. They know that their attempts to put up these ads would in fact be blocked by many metro authorities. Yeah? But that itself is an opportunity to generate controversy. So they factor that in. And in fact, it means that they are able to get far more publicity from the controversy than they could from the simple ad purchase. In some cases, when the Metro Authority tries to block it, they then take it to court. Additional publicity. So in the case of Seattle, I understand what happened was that it did go to court. The courts decided that the metro system's refusal to allow these ads did not violate the Constitution because these particular ads that they had violated the advertising regulations because it was misleading in some way. They had taken an FBI poster and doctored it, and therefore the court ruled that this was misleading advertising and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. But the other metro systems have had to go through various contortions in order to keep these ads out. So you may have also read that in Washington, D.C., what the metro system did, in order to avoid being accused of suppressing one particular viewpoint, they decided, well, let's ban all issue-based ads. They did this last year, yeah? Because if they had only banned anti-Muslim ads, of course, that there have been precedents where the Supreme Court does not like that as viewpoint discrimination. So all these court cases, again, allow the Islamophobia network to get its talking points out at a relatively cheap price. It doesn't actually matter whether the ads ultimately come out because it gets free publicity for its campaign. Yeah? So as an exercise in marketing and public relations, the Islamophobia network really does know what it's doing, and they shouldn't be underestimated. But that's generally true, I think, of all hate spin proponents, all hate spin activists. We would be making a big mistake if we underestimate them and assume that these are just emotional, visceral campaigns. No. They're extremely sophisticated. They know how to get their messages across. The point about tactical versatility is something else that I found out about hate spin. One of the choices that hate spin exponents need to make is whether to use conventional hate speech, which is incitement, or indignation. My hunch after looking at these various cases is that it is becoming harder and harder, thankfully, to use direct incitement in civilized political discourse. Reasonable people are turned off by incitement. So these days, in the 21st century, you can't actually stand up and say, get these migrants out, get these, kill these minorities, right? Or these minorities shouldn't be living here and so on. It is no longer taken too lightly by most civilized countries. So therefore, depending on if those social norms of civility apply in a country, in a society, the use of righteous indignation as a campaign strategy, as opposed to incitement, becomes a lot more attractive. So instead of saying that we want you out, where you appear to be the aggressor, you instead act like you're the victim. Right? That here's our beliefs being threatened by this group and their expression. We're the ones who need to be defended. We need to be defended by this dangerous from this dangerous ideology. We need to be defended from pornography and so on. Which is why I think that the use of righteous indignation as a hate spin strategy is something that we see more and more in democracies. It is just so attractive as a way of putting your opponents on the defensive. But even after you decide on indignation as the way to go, there are other choices to be made. Yeah? You find that different tactics can achieve different goals. Some tactics are good at mobilizing the grassroots. One example from the US is the book challenge. I mean, as you know, education is a local matter in the US. Yeah? So if you are a national network that needs to get local activists energized, one smart way to do it is to get them to challenge the books in their local libraries, the textbooks in their school systems, and so on. And this is happening quite actively, pioneered by the religious right, now adopted by the Islamophobia network as a very conscious strategy as well. It's so common, but also so underreported that the American Library Association every year has a banned books week to remind Americans that, look, the days of censorship are not over, right? There are still books being removed from libraries and schools by hypersensitive groups, often with a political agenda. Yeah? So the advantage of this particular kind of activism, in the US case, the book challenge, is that it gets it's hyper-local, so it gets activists on the ground energized, gives them something to do. Right? They may not be able to influence national politics in Washington, but they can get on the back of the school board. Right? They can go after the local library. In terms of getting wider publicity, it's not a particularly effective tactic in hate spin, unless you pick a very prominent target like Harry Potter. But in most cases, the book challenges are not very well publicized, which is precisely why the American Library Association actually has to whip up awareness with this banned books week. So how do you get more national publicity? You go after high-profile targets. You go after big Bollywood movies in India. So one of the biggest Bollywood movies that came out last year was this movie called PK, starring one of India's top actors, Amir Khan. And it was a wonderful satire of the role of religion in politics, yeah, which got the Hindu right absolutely livid. So they started burning posters of him, call for a national boycott, and so on. Tactically, a great thing to do, because what you're effectively doing is riding on the launch publicity of any big movie or book and so on. Right? You think of the amount of money that studios invest in pre-launch or pre-release publicity. If you time your protest right, you get to ride on that. Fortunately, the good news about this is that Indians didn't pay attention at all to this campaign. So PK now holds the record of the highest grossing Indian movie of all time, right? Despite the Hindu rights protests.
Is it despite it, or is it?
Well, exactly, yeah, that's a good point. It's a good point. The Streisand effect, right? So it may have actually added to the publicity, which again actually reminds me that that again illustrates the symbolic intent behind many of these campaigns. It is not that these conservatives around the world are too stupid to understand the Streisand effect. They know full well that that asking for something to be censored is likely to increase viewership, increase publicity for it. That in that sense is counterproductive. It is counterproductive if your real intent is to make sure nobody knows about it. But that is not their real intent. Their real intent is to, in fact, use these books, videos, films, etc., as a way to get their point across. Yeah? Here's another example, which I think is very interesting for those of us who are interested in internet censorship. I would argue that there are very few household names in the world that are today bigger than Google. Yeah? So in the same way that it makes perfect sense for a hate spin activist to go after a major Hollywood or Bollywood production, it makes sense for hate spin activists to go after Google. Yeah? So the protests around the YouTube video Innocence of Muslims, because YouTube is owned by Google, was an opportunity to use Google's name as part of a worldwide campaign. Yeah? it's much more likely that a campaign against Google is going to get you headlines than if you campaigned against some book from the University of Washington Press, right? or any sort of academic work or something. Yeah? So, and I think we do need to factor that in, the fact that Google today is a sitting duck for these kinds of campaigns. The other sort of target or other goal that the hate speech activists have, in addition to reaching out to the grassroots, in addition to getting publicity out to the wider community, is how to engage elites, how to get your top decision makers in your city or your state or your country to pay attention. And again, here's where I think the US Islamophobia Network really knows what it's doing. It has, for the last 5-6 years, it has campaigned to put anti-Sharia legislation in the books in various states. They've been successful in about 11 states in the US. So now there are 11 states in the US that have either introduced laws or constitutional amendments banning international law. The real target is Sharia law. Yeah? Those behind it acknowledge that these laws don't make any difference. I mean, if they did make a difference, they would probably be unconstitutional. So they've been written, they've been written in a way to actually not have to make any difference. In about 22 other states, those proposals have reached state legislatures. So altogether, more than 30 states in the US have considered the need for anti-Sharia law. The great thing about this campaign, which is a campaign against a non-existent threat, since Muslims only make up 1% of the population, and nobody that anybody knows is actually campaigning for Sharia, so why do we need an anti-Sharia law? The great thing about it is that it then forces your state senators, your courts and so on to actually have a position on it. So unlike the banned books campaign, on which governors and mayors and state senators and so on don't need to have a position, if this reaches your state legislature, suddenly your elected representatives do need to take a position. Suddenly, Sharia becomes part of the high status political discourse. Right? It is no longer the paranoid discourse of the lunatic fringe. Well, it is still that, but amazingly, the paranoid discourse of the lunatic fringe now enters the highest forums in the land, thanks to this campaign. Yeah? As a mark of its success in 2012, anti-Sharia was put on the Republican platform. I don't know whether it is still on the platform for 2016. It's something to watch. Looking at how Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, how well they're doing right now, I wouldn't be surprised if it's there again in the Republican platform for 2016. But you've got to stop and think, how in the world is that possible? Why is a solution to a non-existent problem part of the national platform of one of the two main parties in the US? This, I think, speaks to the genius of these lobby groups in inserting their rhetoric, inserting the language into the national debate. The final attribute of hate spin that I want to talk about is how it is networked and layered. What do I mean by this? This is a feature of hate spin that makes it especially difficult to regulate, because it gives the top leaders deniability. Yeah. Hate speech law, which exists in many parts of the world, most hate speech, of course, is protected by the First Amendment, but it would be against the law in most of Western Europe, in Canada, Australia, and so on. Certainly in India and the rest of the Commonwealth. Hate speech law is designed for to catch speakers who use explicit incitement in a very self-contained way. So, for example, if you are a party leader and you say to your followers that, look, we've got to get this minority out, join me tomorrow, we're going to enter this ghetto and get them out, right? That would probably cross the legal threshold in a number of countries and would be declared as incitement, and therefore the speaker would have broken the law. It turns out that that kind of hate speech law doesn't work because most hate speech in political discourse doesn't happen that way. It doesn't need to, because the top leaders don't ever need to be that explicit. They can simply use the power of suggestion. They're able to use the power of suggestion because others have done the dirty work for them, right? Activists on the ground, stuff on the internet and so on, have been more explicit. They just need to hint at it, right? And because they're just hinting at it, no court could ever find them guilty. Yeah? Let me give you the example of one prime exponent of this, who is Narendra Modi. There is no doubt that he is personally responsible and culpable for anti-Muslim hatred in India. But he's managed to keep his hands legally clean by relying on lieutenants to do the dirty work for him. Yeah? So this is a picture of him at one of the final rally speeches that he gave before the 2014 election. You'll notice behind him is a picture of Hindu god. It happens to be Lord Rama. The significance of that portrait is that this speech was given just outside the city of Ayodhya, which is, according to Hindutva, the Hindu nationalists, is the birthplace of Lord Ram, and where they had destroyed Muslim mosque, which they said was built over Rama's birthplace. It's an extremely one of the most controversial sites in India. Yeah? The Supreme Court has declared that nobody's going to take ownership of it, nobody's going to build anything now, right? The use of religious imagery and so on violates Indian election law, but didn't stop him, right? Didn't stop him. He didn't make any explicit references to this great triumph of the Hindu right, which was to tear down the mosque, and the Hindu right's desire to build the temple in its place. Those words never came out of his mouth. But if you look at the picture of the backdrop, what you see there is Hindu temple, right? So here he is speaking in the next city, Faizabad, just outside Ayodhya, the birthplace of Lord Ram, where the Hindu right wants to build a giant Hindu temple over the ruins of the mosque that they destroyed. He doesn't refer to any of that explicitly, but there's Lord Ram behind him, and there's a Hindu temple used as the backdrop. Hate speech, no court could ever convict him. But that's the way modern, effective hate speech works at the very top levels. Yeah? And here's something he said. 10 years ago, in Gujarat, there used to be many riots. But now the people of Gujarat know they have to live in peace, to live free from the politics of polarization. They know they have to take the path of development, and all is calm. Anything wrong with that? Would a court convict him for hate? It doesn't, even for most reasonable people, it doesn't sound like hate speech. But what's unsaid? The context of this is this. I mean, of course, Gujarat is known to the Hindu right for the massacre of 2002. And since then, the massacre has always been framed by the Hindu right, by his own lieutenants, as finally teaching the Muslims a lesson. Right? The Muslims and other minorities have gotten things too easy under Congress rule. This is our effort to finally teach Muslims a lesson. And that line, that Gujarat was about teaching Muslims a lesson so they would know their place in India, is something that's never been contradicted by anyone at the top of Narendra Modi's party or by himself. In that context, where for more than a decade, the Hindu right has been told Gujarat was about teaching Muslims a lesson, suddenly when you say something like, 10 years ago there were many riots, but now all is calm, it's far more chilling, isn't it? What does he mean by calm? It's not a voluntary calm. It is a calm enforced by one of the worst pogroms in India after independence. Yeah? So his audience knows full well what he's referring to, but legally there's no way to hold him responsible for hate speech or incitement. Yeah? So this is the art of incitement when used by sophisticated political actors. And this is the kind of speech that the law really has no answer to. Yeah? So I've been emphasizing this contrast between incitement on the one hand and insult on the other. I know that the US has a unique take on both of these because your First Amendment is uniquely strong. Most incitement is protected by the First Amendment. The International Human Rights Standard, though, would consider incitement to be not protected by the right to free speech. Yeah? So the International Human Rights Standard would prohibit incitement to discrimination as well as incitement to violence. Most of Western Europe, most democracies follow this standard rather than the US First Amendment standard. But the important thing is that whether it's Europe or the US, what is very clear is that speech that merely shocks or offends is protected as a right. Yeah? The right to free speech is meaningless if it does not protect one's right to shock or offend. The law only has justification in prohibiting that speech if it crosses the line into incitement. Yeah? And I think that's sensible. It's a sensible response to hate spin. Many countries make the mistake of trying to regulate insult. Yeah? I argue that this is the worst possible thing that you could do in any society that has hate spin going on. Insult laws basically play into the hands of hate spin exponents because it gives them legal muscle for their campaigns of indignation. Right? They can not only say that this film offends us, they can say this film offends us and according to this section of the law, that film must be banned. Right? And the government is enforced to at least investigate and often to prosecute as well. These laws, insult laws in the countries that have them, assume good faith on the part of the offended. It assumes that those who take offense only do it, only complain when their feelings are genuinely offended, right? And they really need to be protected from some kind of harm. But what do you do when that offense is manufactured? As I would argue is the case in most of these big examples of outrage. I would say I have yet to come across any case of outrage that lasts longer than a day and that involves thousands of people that is not manufactured, that really is purely the result of individuals who feel so aggrieved because their identities have been assaulted. There are always hate spin manufacturers, political activists behind them. The last thing you want to do in such a situation is to arm them, is to reinforce and incentivize that kind of campaign by giving them insult laws on which to depend. But I would also argue that incitement laws are necessary but hopelessly inadequate. They're hopelessly inadequate for the reasons that I gave, that most incitement, the most dangerous kinds of incitement, is distributed in a way that makes legal culpability very difficult to pin down. What do we do about it? Let me actually skip these in the interest of time. A little late in the day, I guess, I realized that maybe those of us interested in freedom of expression are looking at the problem all along, that we have been focused too much on speech and not enough on action. Maybe what's needed is not protection from hate speech or offense. What's needed is protection against actual discrimination. That in fact, religious minorities might be willing to tolerate insult, verbal abuse, if at the end of the day they had the assurance that on the things that really matter, like the right to build a mosque or the church, the state is going to stand up for them. Yeah? This struck me especially when I visited this mosque in the US, the one in Tennessee, right, that had been subject to vile, lies and propaganda about Muslims and so on. Right? The imam there, whose name unfortunately is Osama, what a gift to the anti-Muslim groups, right? So Imam Osama tells me that, of course it was difficult to endure 2 years of vilification, but at the end of the day, we knew the Constitution would be on our side. Right? He later gave TEDx presentation where he said something extremely moving and profound. He said, look, the first time he entered a US courtroom was in one of those cases where the county, Rutherford County, had sided with the Islamophobes. I think it was the case where they were trying to declare that Islam is not a religion. And so Osama describes his wonderment, right, at entering this courtroom and sitting down and watching attorneys representing the United States take on the local authorities of Rutherford County. So Osama says, so there I was watching USA versus Rutherford County, and what an impact it made for me as someone from the Middle East, to see USA versus Rutherford County, and where USA was standing up for me as a Muslim. Right? And he describes his profound appreciation for the Constitution on the basis of that. And I think I've seen that again and again, and in contrast, where this Christian group in Jakarta still waiting for their church to be built because the state does not stand up for them. Think of what a profound impact it makes, what a profound incentive it gives to minorities to be part of the constitutional order when they're absolutely convinced that at the end of the day, the Constitution and the state, the federal government, is going to stand up for minority rights. Once I think minorities have that confidence, I think they are willing to endure vilification and hate speech without opting out of the system and resorting to violence, for example. I mean, of course, ideally, we want to remove the hate speech as well. But I do think we've got to prioritize anti-discrimination laws, equality protecting laws, and not just focus on whether speech is supportive or against minorities. Yeah? So let me end there. I've taken more than an hour, and leave the rest of the time for questions if there are any.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.